The air inside the restaurant was thick with a kind of quiet wealth. It wasn't loud or flashy, but you could feel it in the way the light from the giant crystal chandeliers softened the edges of everything, in the heavy hush that fell over the tables even when people were talking. This was La Belle Epoque, a name that promised a time of beauty and elegance. And for the people dining there tonight, it delivered. Every table was draped in white linen so clean it seemed to glow, and the silverware was polished to a perfect mirror shine, reflecting the faces of the people who held it. These were not just regular people having a night out. This was a gathering of the city's most powerful, a private gala for a foundation run by a man who had made a fortune in technology. The room was a sea of expensive haircuts, tailored suits, and dresses that probably cost more than a car. The scent in the air was a mix of expensive perfume, the rich smell of truffle and butter from the kitchen, and the faint, sweet aroma of the lilas in the center of each table. It was the smell of success. The conversations were just as carefully crafted as the outfits. At one table, a man with a very large watch was talking loudly, not to the people with him, but so that other tables could hear. He was explaining a recent art purchase, using words nobody really understood but everyone nodded along to, impressed. At another table, a woman whose necklace was a river of diamonds laughed a high, sharp laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was listening to a story, but her gaze was darting around the room, seeing who was seeing her. Everyone was performing. They were smiling practiced smiles, telling stories that made them sound important, and clinking champagne flutes in a silent toast to their own status. It was a world built on appearances, where what you had was more important than who you were. They moved through their evening with a kind of practiced grace, a dance they had all learned long ago. They were the main characters in this story, or so they thought. Moving through this world was another man, a shadow who was part of the furniture but was never seen. He was old, with shoulders that were permanently bent from years of work, and he wore the simple, dark uniform of the night janitor. His shoes were worn and soft, making no sound on the thick carpet as he moved from table to table. His job was to be invisible, and he was very good at it. He would appear silently as a table finished their main course, clearing the heavy plates with a quiet efficiency that was almost like a magic trick. The diners didn't look at him. They didn't have to. To them, he was just part of the room's machinery, like the soft music playing from hidden speakers or the gentle hum of the air conditioning. He would clear away their crumbs of expensive bread and their half-finished glasses of wine, and they would continue their conversations without missing a beat, as if the plates had simply vanished on their own, but the old man saw everything. As he wiped a stray drop of sauce from the pristine tablecloth, his eyes would take in the details. He saw the way a man would pat his wife's hand absent-mindedly while his eyes followed a younger woman across the room. He saw the genuine flicker of boredom on the face of a young woman who was being shown off by her much older husband. He saw the subtle power plays, the quiet competitions, and the loneliness that hid behind the bright smiles and the glittering jewelry. He felt the coldness of the room, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the coldness of a world where connections were transactions and emotions were weaknesses to be hidden. He was a ghost in their machine, a silent observer to a life that was so close, yet completely out of reach. His cart was his island. A simple metal trolley stacked with clean cloths, bins for waste, and spray bottles with clear liquids. It was a world of function and necessity, a stark contrast to the world of luxury and excess that surrounded it. As he pushed his cart, he would sometimes catch a snippet of a conversation about a stock market trend or a vacation on a private island, and the words would feel like they were from a different language. He lived a life of quiet routine, of paying bills and counting small change, while these people discussed millions as if it were loose change. There was no bitterness in him, not anymore. It was just a deep, settled weariness, a sense of being on the outside looking in, always. He had accepted his place in the world, and his place was here, in the shadows, cleaning up after the people who lived in the light, every now and then. As he made his rounds, his path would take him near the small stage at the front of the room, and on that stage, bathed in its own soft spotlight, was a grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, made of a dark, polished wood that seemed to drink the light. Its lid was propped open, revealing the pristine white and black keys, waiting. Most nights it was just for decoration, a prop that added to the restaurant's elegant image. But for the old man, it was the only real thing in the entire room. Whenever he passed it, something inside him would shift. His steps would slow, and his eyes, usually tired and downcast, would lift and fix upon it. It was a look of such intense longing, such deep and complicated sadness, that it seemed out of place on his quiet, unassuming face. It was a look that held 1,000 memories, a whole lifetime that no one in this room could ever guess at. He would stand there for just a second, his cleaning rag held loosely in his hand, and the world of clinking glasses and fake laughter would fade away. In that moment, there was only him and the piano. His gnarled, arthritic fingers would sometimes twitch at his side, the rough, swollen knuckles a testament to a life of hard physical labor. But looking at those hands, you might almost be able to imagine them once moving with a different kind of purpose, dancing across those ivory keys with a speed and grace that could leave a room full of wealthy diners in absolute disbelief. Then, just as quickly, the spell would break. He would blink, look away, and continue his silent journey through the shadows, a ghost with a secret, leaving the piano waiting in the light. The woman in charge of the evening was a tightly wound coil of professional anxiety. Her name was not important to the guests. To them, she was simply the organizer, the one who made the magic happen. But tonight, the magic was threatening to unravel. She moved through the room with a forced, brittle smile, her eyes constantly scanning, checking, and worrying. She smoothed a non-existent crease in her expensive suit, her fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against her thigh. Every detail had to be perfect. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a statement, a monument to the success and generosity of the tech billionaire who was hosting it. Her entire career, her reputation, was riding on this one night. She had planned it for months, coordinating everything from the specific shade of white for the tablecloths to the exact temperature of the chablis. The final, crowning piece of her perfect evening was about to begin. The main course plates had been cleared away by the silent, efficient staff, and the air was filled with the low, contented hum of people who had eaten well and drunk even better. The grand piano on the small stage was the center of unspoken attention. It was time for the performance. The organizer took a deep, steadying breath, giving a subtle nod to the sound technician in the corner. The lights in the dining area dimmed slightly, and a soft, single spotlight illuminated the piano, making the dark wood gleam. A murmur of appreciation went through the room. This was it. The moment she had been building towards. She watched the doorway, expecting the renowned young pianist, the prodigy she had flown in all the way from Vienna to make his grand entrance. But the doorway remained empty. The seconds ticked by, stretching into an uncomfortable silence. The low hum of conversation began to fade, replaced by a curious quiet. People started to shift in their seats, their eyes moving from the empty stage to the host's table. The organizer's smile felt like it was cracking. She felt a cold drop of sweat trace a path down her back. She turned to her assistant, a young man who looked even more terrified than she felt, and gave him a sharp, questioning look. He just shook his head, his face pale, holding up a phone as if it were a dead snake. He rushed over to her, his movements clumsy and frantic. He whispered the news, his voice a panicked hiss that was meant to be inaudible, but carried a weight of its own. There had been an accident. A minor one, but enough. The pianist was at the hospital. He was not coming. The words hit the organizer like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. No pianist. No main event. Just a room full of the most influential people in the city, all expecting to be entertained, all now staring at an empty stage. The host, the tech billionaire, caught her eye from across the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just raised a single, questioning eyebrow, a look of cold, sharp disappointment that was far worse than any shout. The message was clear. Fix it, now. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, the silence a physical weight pressing down on her. She could feel the collective boredom and impatience beginning to simmer. The perfect evening was becoming a perfect disaster. She started pacing. A caged animal in a designer suit, her mind racing through impossible solutions. Could she get a recording? No, that would be cheap and insulting. Could another musician be found at this hour? Impossible. She was trapped, a shipwreck survivor on an island of priceless china and judgmental stares. In her frantic, blind pacing, she turned quickly and walked straight into something solid. It wasn't a wall or a chair. It was a person. She stumbled back, an apology dying on her lips as she saw who it was. It was the old janitor standing quietly by his cart, a permanent fixture she had never truly noticed until now. He had simply been in her path, a silent obstacle in her sea of chaos. An initial flash of irritation at his presence warred with the overwhelming tide of her panic. It was then that the restaurant manager, a man who had seen countless crises unfold in this very room, approached them. He had seen the whole thing, the frantic whisper, the host's icy glare, the organizer's desperate pacing. He looked at the janitor, then at the organizer, and a strange, almost reckless idea sparked in his eyes. He let out a small, dry chuckle. "Well," he said, his voice calm and steady in the midst of the storm, "there's only one other person in this building who can play that thing." He gestured with a casual nod of his head towards the janitor. The organizer stared at him, her mind unable to process the words. She looked from the manager's unnervingly calm face to the old man in the simple uniform, who was now shaking his head and holding up his hands as if to push the very idea away. The manager continued, a half-smile playing on his lips. "He plays a little after hours?" "Beautifully, actually." The suggestion was so absurd, so utterly ridiculous, that for a moment the organizer thought he was making a cruel joke. She let out a short, sharp laugh that was devoid of any humor. "Him?" she said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and scorn. "You can't be serious." But the manager just held her gaze, his expression unwavering. And in that look she saw that he was not joking. He was offering her a life raft, a strange, flimsy, utterly insane life raft in the middle of a shark-infested ocean. Her eyes fell upon the old janitor again. She really looked at him this time. She saw his stooped shoulders, his worn-out shoes, the roughness of his hands. She imagined those hands, which were probably used to scrubbing floors and taking out trash, touching the pristine keys of that grand piano. The image was impossible. It was a joke. But as she heard the host clear his throat pointedly from across the room, and felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes waiting for a show that wasn't coming, she realized that a joke might be the only thing she had left. Desperation, she was discovering, was a powerful force that could make even the most insane idea seem like a possibility. The organizer's mind, a frantic whirlwind of disaster scenarios, crashed to a halt. The manager's words hung in the air between them, absurd and yet strangely magnetic. Her eyes darted from the manager's unnervingly calm face to the old janitor, who was now shaking his head, his hands held up in a gesture of firm, almost desperate refusal. It was a joke, it had to be. But then she caught the host's gaze again, a look so cold and sharp it felt like a physical touch. In that moment, the absurd became the only option. Desperation, she realized with a sickening lurch in her stomach, was a powerful acid that burned away all sense of propriety. She took a step towards the old man, her expensive heels sinking slightly into the thick carpet. Her world of polished surfaces and perfect control was about to get very, very messy. She approached him not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. Her voice, when she spoke, was a mixture of pleading and command, a tone she used with underperforming contractors. "Sir," she began, the word feeling foreign and formal on her tongue. "We have a situation, a very serious situation. Our performer has had an accident." She paused, expecting this to carry some weight, but the old man just looked at her with tired, patient eyes, as if waiting for her to get to the point. She pressed on, her words tumbling out in a rush. "The manager seems to think. He says you can play." She let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Look, I don't care what you play. Just a few simple tunes, background music, something to fill the silence." She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a thick wad of cash, holding it out to him like a peace offering. "I'll make it worth your while, more than you make in a month. Just play for 20 minutes, please." The old man looked at the money in her hand, and then his eyes lifted to meet hers. There was no greed in his gaze, no flicker of interest. Instead, she saw something that looked like a deep, profound hurt. He took a small step back, away from her and the offensive offer. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but firm, carrying a surprising strength. "I can't do that. I'm no performer." He shook his head again, more emphatically this time. "You should find someone else." The words were not a negotiation. They were a final statement. He turned slightly as if to go back to his cart, to retreat into the familiar safety of his work, to disappear back into the shadows where he belonged. The organizer felt a fresh wave of panic. This wasn't working. Her only tool, the one thing that always worked in her world, was useless here. It was the manager who stepped in then, placing a gentle hand on the old man's shoulder, stopping his retreat. He gave the organizer a subtle but dismissive look, a clear signal that she had made things worse. He then turned his full attention to the janitor, his entire demeanor softening. The authority in his voice was replaced by something warmer, something that spoke of a long, quiet acquaintance. "Hey, now," he said, his voice low and calm. "It's all right. We're not asking for a concert." He looked past the old man, his eyes scanning the restless room, before coming back to rest on his face. "But look at them. They're like sharks smelling blood in the water. The host is furious. It's going to be a nightmare for all of us." He paused, letting the words sink in. He wasn't appealing to the man's greed or his ambition. He was appealing to his sense of community, to a shared duty in this small, enclosed world. Just one song, an old one, something simple, to calm the room, for me. We need to save the night, or we'll all be hearing about this for months. The old man stood there, a silent battle raging behind his tired eyes. He looked at the manager's face, a face he saw every single night, a man who had always treated him with a quiet, unspoken dignity. He could feel the weight of that request, not as a command, but as a favor asked between friends. His gaze then drifted across the room, taking in the sea of expectant, impatient faces. He saw the smirks, the whispers, the utter condescension. They saw him as a joke, a temporary distraction. The thought of playing for them, of exposing the most private part of his soul to this cold, judgmental audience, filled him with a deep sense of dread. It felt like a violation. But then he looked back at the manager, at the genuine plea in his eyes. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of his entire life. It was a sigh of pure resignation. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A murmur rippled through the nearby tables as people watched the strange exchange conclude. The organizer, seeing her chance, scurried back to the safety of the sidelines, her role in this bizarre drama complete. The old man placed his cleaning rag neatly on his cart, a final, small act of order before stepping into chaos. He began to walk towards the stage. His steps were slow, heavy, as if his shoes were filled with lead. The soft, worn rubber solace made no sound on the plush carpet, but his movement created a wave of silence that spread through the room like a ripple in a pond. Conversations died. Heads turned. Every eye was now fixed on this impossible figure, a ghost from the kitchen making his way to the spotlight. The whispers started as hushed giggles and knowing glances. A woman in a sequin dress leaned over to her date and whispered something behind her hand, and they both laughed, a soft, ugly sound that carried in the quiet room. A man with a monocle actually adjusted it, as if to get a better look at the absurdity unfolding before him. They thought it was a piece of avant-garde theater, a deliberate joke. The idea that this old man, this cleaner, was actually going to play the grand piano was the height of comedy to them. They settled in, ready to be amused by his inevitable failure. The old man felt their eyes on him, 100 tiny needles pricking at his skin. He felt their scorn and their amusement, and it made his stomach churn. He was a spectacle, a clown in their circus. He kept his eyes fixed on the piano, his only destination, his only sanctuary in this hostile sea of faces. He reached the small, raised platform and hesitated at the single step up. It seemed like a cliff edge. The whole world had shrunk to this one small space, this one impossible task. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. He wasn't a musician, not anymore. That was a different life, a different person, a ghost he had laid to rest long ago. He was just a man who cleaned up other people's messes. What was he doing? He placed a hand on the polished wood of the piano to steady himself, the cool, smooth surface a shock against his rough, calloused skin. Then, with a final, deep breath that he felt in his very bones, he stepped up onto the stage. He turned and sat down on the velvet bench. The contrast was jarring, almost obscene. His simple, dark uniform faded from 1,000 washes against the lush, deep red of the expensive fabric. The room was now completely silent. The smirks had faded, replaced by a confused, curious stillness. The joke, it seemed, had gone on long enough that it was no longer funny. It was just strange. The old man sat there for a long moment, his back to the room, a solitary, hunched figure. He stared at the keys, the pristine white and black rectangles, looking like a foreign language he had once known fluently but had long since forgotten. He slowly, deliberately placed his hands in his lap. And then he brought them up and hovered them over the keys. His hands were a spectacle in themselves. They were the hands of a laborer. The knuckles were swollen and gnarled with arthritis. The skin was tough and leathery, etched with the lines of countless years of hard work. The nails were short and broken, rimmed with a faint trace of dirt that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully remove. These were hands that were meant to hold a mop, a wrench, a broom. They looked clumsy, awkward, and utterly out of place hovering over the keys of an instrument that cost more than a car. The audience watched, transfixed by this final, impossible image. It was the setup for a punchline they were all waiting for. He closed his eyes for just a second, shutting out the lights, the people, the expectations. In that darkness, there was only the memory of music, the ghost of a melody. Then his fingers, those tired, broken workers' hands, descended. His fingers, those tired, broken workers' hands, descended upon the keys. The first notes that emerged were simple, almost childlike. A soft, hesitant melody that drifted into the quiet room like a shy animal. It was pleasant enough, but it was exactly what the diners expected. A few simple plodding chords, a background tune. The smirks returned. A man at a nearby table quietly picked up his fork, ready to continue his dessert. The woman in the sequin dress gave a little shrug to her companion, as if to say, "See? I told you so." They were settling in for a few minutes of mediocrity, a quaint little interruption to their evening of luxury. The old man's posture was still stooped, his eyes fixed on the keys as if he were reading a very difficult recipe. He looked exactly like what he was, an old man trying his best to play a song he barely remembered, but then something shifted. It wasn't a sudden change, but a slow, creeping transformation, like the first light of dawn spreading across a dark sky. The simple melody began to grow, to twist and turn in on itself. A new layer of sound was added, a complex harmony that wove around the original tune like a vine. The hesitant plodding was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. The music was no longer just a tune. It was becoming a story. The man who had picked up his fork stopped, his hand frozen halfway to his mouth. The woman in the sequin dress leaned forward, her head tilted, a look of confusion replacing her smugness. The sound was coming from the same old man in the same simple uniform, but it was different. It was beautiful. Not just beautiful for a janitor, but genuinely, breathtakingly beautiful. The music began to swell, gaining a momentum that was undeniable. It was no longer a quiet story. It was a passionate, sweeping epic. The sound that filled the room was not just technically flawless. It was imbued with a lifetime of feeling. It was the sound of joy, sharp and brilliant like a flash of sunlight. It was the sound of deep, aching sadness, a mournful cry that seemed to come from the very soul of the piano. It was the sound of love found and love lost, of triumph and of despair. The old man's fingers, which had looked so clumsy and awkward just moments before, were now flying across the keys with a speed and grace that seemed impossible. They were no longer the hands of a laborer. They were the hands of a master, a magician conjuring emotions out of thin air. His gnarled knuckles and swollen joints moved with a fluidity that defied their appearance, each note perfect, each chord a wave of pure sound. The clinking of cutlery had ceased completely. The low hum of conversation, the very background noise of the restaurant, had died away, leaving a void that was now filled entirely by the piano. Every single person in the room was transfixed. The tech billionaire, who had been scrolling through his phone with a look of bored impatience, had slowly lowered the device to the table. His mouth was slightly agape, his eyes wide with a disbelief that had nothing to do with business or technology. He was just a man listening to something that was touching a part of him he had forgotten existed. The famed food critic, who had been poised to write a scathing review about the evening's entertainment, had forgotten all about his notebook. His pen lay idle on the table as he stared, his usual analytical expression replaced by one of pure, unadulterated awe. The music grew louder, more intense. It was a torrent, a flood of sound that washed over the room, cleansing it of its cynicism and its coldness. The old man was no longer sitting. He was leaning into the piano, his body swaying with the rhythm of the music. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of intense concentration and raw emotion. He wasn't in a restaurant full of wealthy diners anymore. He was somewhere else, in another time, another life. The music was his memories, his dreams, his heartbreaks, all pouring out of him through the keys. He was a conduit for a passion so deep and so pure that it transcended the man himself. The audience was no longer seeing a janitor playing a piano. They were witnessing a revelation. They were being given a glimpse into a soul so rich and so profound that it shamed the shallow, materialistic world they inhabited. The woman with the river of diamonds around her neck had a single tear tracing a path down her perfectly powdered cheek. She wasn't wiping it away. She was staring at the old man, her usual mask of social performance completely gone. In his music she heard the echo of a love she had never known, a depth of feeling she had only ever read about in books. The man with the very large watch had taken it off and was holding it in his hand, not looking at its price or its prestige, but just feeling its cold, dead weight. It seemed so insignificant now. The music was making them question everything, not with words, but with a feeling that was more powerful than any argument. It was the sound of a life fully lived, a life of struggle and beauty, and it was putting their own carefully curated existences to shame. The performance reached its peak, a crescendo of such breathtaking power and complexity that it felt like the room might explode with the sheer force of it. The notes cascaded down the scales like a waterfall, a storm of sound that was both chaotic and perfectly controlled. It was a cry of defiance, a shout of pure, unadulterated life against the quiet desperation of the world around it. The old man's hands were a blur of motion, a dance of incredible precision and power. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm subsided. The torrent of notes slowed, the passion softened into a deep, melancholic beauty. The final chords were played, not with a bang, but with a tender, aching sadness that hung in the air like a final, whispered goodbye. The last note faded, but the sound didn't disappear. It seemed to be absorbed by the very walls of the restaurant, by the crystal glasses and the silver cutlery, by the stunned hearts of everyone in the room. There was a profound, sacred silence. It was a silence so heavy and so complete that you could have heard a pin drop, or in this case, the quiet, ragged breath of the old man as he sat, his hands still resting on the keys. He kept his eyes closed for a long moment, as if he were afraid to open them and return to the world he had just left. The spell was not yet broken. The diners sat frozen, not out of politeness, but because they were truly and utterly lost in the echo of what they had just heard. They were no longer a collection of wealthy, important people. They were just an audience, humbled and speechless, in the presence of something they could not explain but would never forget. The sacred silence in the room stretched on, thick and heavy, a living thing that held everyone captive. It lasted for what felt like an eternity, a moment suspended outside of time. The diners, the host, the staff, everyone was frozen in the wake of the sound. their minds struggling to process the raw, unfiltered emotion they had just experienced. They had come expecting a performance, an item on a schedule, a distraction. Instead, they had been witness to a soul being laid bare. The silence was finally broken not by a polite cough or a murmur of conversation, but by a single, sharp sound. A chair scraped back against the polished floor. Every head turned. It was the tech billionaire, the host of the gala, the man whose disappointment had felt like a death sentence just minutes before. He was on his feet, his phone forgotten on the table, his expression not one of bored authority, but of pure, unadulterated awe. He began to clap. It wasn't a polite golf clap. It was a single, loud, decisive sound that echoed in the silent room. Then he clapped again and again. It was the sound of a dam breaking. As if his action had given them permission, another person stood up and then another. A wave of movement rippled through the dining room until every single person was on their feet. The applause that followed was not just loud. It was a physical force. It was a roar of emotion, a thunderous, heartfelt ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The crystal chandeliers trembled, and the air vibrated with the sound. People were not just clapping. They were shouting, "Bravo!" and "Encore!" Their faces, which had been masks of cool indifference just an hour ago, were now flushed with emotion, some with tears streaming openly down their cheeks. They were clapping for the music, for the feeling, for the impossible, the beautiful mystery of it all, but the man who had created this storm was not basking in its center. On the stage, the old janitor flinched, as if the sound of the applause were a physical blow. He slowly opened his eyes, and the look on his face was not one of pride or triumph. It was a look of shock, of profound and utter fear. He stared out at the roaring crowd, at the sea of faces turned towards him, and he looked like a trapped animal. For him, the applause was not a reward. It was an exposure. The music was his most private, sacred language, a conversation he had always had with himself, and he had just shouted it to a room full of strangers. The intimacy of the moment had been shattered by the very publicness of their reaction. He saw their adoration, their awe, and it terrified him. They were trying to pull him into their world, to make him a part of their spectacle. And it was the last thing he wanted. He gave a small, jerky nod, a gesture that was not a bow, but a desperate plea for it to be over. Then he stood up from the velvet bench and turned his back on the ovation. He didn't walk towards his cleaning cart. He didn't even glance at the organizer, who was already rushing towards the stage, her face a mixture of triumph and a new kind of greed. He moved with a quick, panicked urgency, retreating not to the shadows of the dining room, but towards a plain, unmarked side door near the stage that led to the kitchens and the back alley. He pushed it open and disappeared through it, the heavy door swinging shut behind him with a soft, final thud, cutting off the sound of the applause as if it had never been dot by the time the organizer reached the stage. Breathless and ready to offer him a fortune, he was gone. The restaurant manager joined her, his face a mixture of pride and concern. They looked at the empty stage, then at the door, and then at each other. The crowd was still on their feet, their applause beginning to soften into a confused murmur. They began to search. The organizer, the manager, and even the host, who had come down from his table, his usual air of authority replaced by an almost childlike curiosity. They checked the kitchens, the storerooms, the staff break room, but the old man was nowhere to be found. He had vanished as completely as a ghost, leaving behind only the echo of his music and a room full of people whose understanding of the world had been fundamentally altered. The night did not end there. A guest, a young woman who had been filming the dessert course on her phone, had captured the entire performance. By the next morning, she had uploaded it to the internet. The video, titled simply "The Ghost of La Belle Époque," went viral with a speed that was unprecedented. It wasn't just the technical perfection of the playing that captivated millions. It was the story, the raw, human drama of it all. The contrast between the man's appearance and the divine music he created was a story that needed no words. News outlets picked it up. Music critics wrote long, flowing articles about the purest expression of art they had ever witnessed. The video became a global phenomenon. A symbol of the idea that true genius can be found in the most unexpected of places. And with the fame came the offers. They poured in from every corner of the globe. Record labels offered contracts with numbers that had more zeros than most people could count. Television shows wanted to book him for exclusive interviews. Symphony orchestras were offering him the chance to perform as a soloist in the world's most prestigious concert halls. The restaurant's phone rang off the hook with people asking for the janitor's name, his story, anything they could find. The organizer saw a career-making opportunity, a story that would make her famous. The manager just hoped the man was okay. But through it all, there was only silence. The old janitor never came forward. He never claimed the fame or the fortune. A few days after the night that changed everything, the restaurant manager found a simple, handwritten note on his desk. It was from the janitor. It just said, "Thank you for everything. I have to go." There was no return address, no forwarding information. He had simply resigned, disappearing from the life he had known as quietly as he had lived it. The last confirmed sighting of him was from a neighbor in his old apartment building. She saw him late one night loading a single, worn-out suitcase into the back of a taxi. He wasn't carrying much. Just the clothes on his back and tucked carefully into his coat pocket, an old, faded photograph of a woman with a gentle smile. As the taxi pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the city lights, the old man looked one last time at the photograph, a sad, peaceful look on his face. He had played for a room full of the world's most powerful people and left them speechless. But as he drove off into his anonymous future, it was clear he was finally going home to the only audience that had ever mattered.